Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, your podcast host, and this week Martin Ross and Jonathan Rust have joined me to talk about World Aquatics, the governing body for the sport of swimming and diving, its record revenues, its agency partners, and whether private equity could see opportunities there. And then we're going to take a very deep dive into the Uefa European Women's Football Championships that finished last week, with a brilliant win for England's Lionesses over world champion Spain. We'll be joined by our colleague Maria Kholodova and by Flo Lloyd-Hughes, founder of the women's football media platform, The Cutback, both of whom will add invaluable insight to the discussion. And now, moving straight into our first topic for the day, I've got Martin Ross, our global news editor, and Jonathan Rust, our global news reporter, online with me today. Hello, Martin and John.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, Martin, to start with you, World Aquatics this week presented its best ever financial results at its Congress in Singapore, with record revenues and a net surplus, and you'll tell us more about those numbers. But as ever, the devil is in the detail. Can you break it down for us? Has swimming outside the Olympics suddenly taken off?
Yeah, we are. Well, let's get the deep dive reference out of the way before somebody else says it. But we have a deep dive into World Aquatics. We do like a pronunciation discussion on the pod. I'm interested that you said aquatics because it's also what the general director of World Aquatics says. But I think that's a North American thing, maybe, because Chad Leclos says aquatics. So pardon me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to go with aquatics. We thought it would be an interesting subject given the results. Maybe we can have a private equity discussion later on. You know, is this the time to be investing in, and I say aquatics on purpose because, yeah, swimming is the lead one, but they did rebrand 2 years ago. Obviously, diving, high diving, water polo, artistic swimming, and open water swimming. They were trying to bring together all the disciplines. So, I mean, the reason we're discussing it, the news this week, that they had released their, best ever finances. There was a bit of a caveat there. So, the revenues, as you said, 107.8 million. That included 38.9 million from Olympic money, 32.1 million US dollars from media rights and sponsorship, and 36.5 million from hosting fees. So, profit of 38.8. and a net surplus of 51.2 once you build in certain investment income and tied revenues. So blockbuster results by the sound of it. The small detail is that this was the first ever time that I believe that the Olympics, World Aquatics Championships and the World Short Course Championships had been held in the same year. So they are skewed, but nonetheless very impressive. I mean, World Aquatics also spoke about the highest ever net operating surplus of $58 million over the quadrennial. Part of the reason for that is it was bookended by 2 Olympic revenue shares, which wouldn't usually happen. But because Tokyo was postponed, there was 2 Olympics in the 4-year cycle. But yeah, I mean, we'll dive into them a bit more. But, I just did a dive into by mistake. I'm even doing it when I'm not meant to. Let's dive into more detail.
So every international federation has a different revenue mix, doesn't it? How does World Aquatics compare? And stripping out the Olympics, was it a particularly good year for them commercially?
Yeah, I mean, swimming does very well from its Olympic share. It sits at the top table in the top tier with athletics and help me out. What's the other one? Would it be gymnastics maybe?
Gymnastics.
So it already gets a strong share, but it's maybe perhaps unusual in that it has a strong share from Olympic revenues, but then also strong commercial revenues. It has recovered commercially post-COVID, as with most IF, took a bad hit from obviously a bunch of cancelled events. That's reflected in the results that have just come out. So if you go back to 2021, their media and sponsorship rights income was $16.5 million US dollars. It's now doubled effectively into 2024. Hosting fees has gone from 6 million up to 36.5 million last year. So funnily enough, despite these being record figures, 2023 was better because the world champs were in, and say it carefully, but Fukuoka in Japan, which is obviously a big market for swimming, and we'll come on to the Dentsu relationship maybe in due course. So the 2023 Worlds in Japan had 29 million commercial rights revenues versus 15.7 for last year's in Doha. So that's quite a big difference. Looking ahead as well, just quickly before maybe the last of the figures we throw at you, but The commercial rights revenues actually combined with hosting is budgeted to drop this year to 61.5 and then fall to about 36 million in 2026, because that is the year when the calendar's really kind of back to normal, and there will not be a World Aquatics Championships in that year, nor will there be an Olympics. So that will be the kind of fallow year, if you like, for in the next accounting period.
Martin, what about World Aquatics' work with agencies? They've always been closely aligned with Dentsu and swimming with Japan as a result. Has that changed in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bigger picture which was kind of tied in with the commercial overhaul and the rebrand when the new president, Hussein Al-Musallam, came in, a new executive came in, led by Brent Nowitzki and obviously James Moy as well on the commercial side. They're thinking of moving the headquarters to Hungary next year. So, yeah, World Aquatics has overhauled how it's commercialized its main events, but certain things have remained. So traditionally it was a kind of EBU deal in Europe and then Dentsu everywhere else. Dentsu took care of the sponsorship. And that's why, I mean, I think it's really interesting actually, if you think growing up watching swimming on the telly or watching athletics on the telly, you would always see stuff like, I don't know, a TDK or a Sony. And this was to do really with the close ties with Japan and Dentsu's involvement. You know, when you're a young, I don't know, 12-year-old watching that on the telly, obviously that doesn't resonate. You don't think that. If it does, and you are a young 12-year-old watching that on the telly now, give us a ring because we want to recruit you. But yeah, that was the reason, because of the close ties with Dentsu. So yeah, I mean, they wanted to change that relationship on the sponsorship side. The model was Dentsu would base its sales on sourcing companies from the Japanese market and where major events were hosted. They've kind of wanted to build up global brands, activating outside of the World Championships. Have they succeeded? Well, I suppose only Sony and Yakult now, two Japan headquartered companies, are among the 5 global partners. They announced Alibaba Cloud this week as a supplier. So that's where they're looking to go on sponsorship. But it's hard. I mean, I remember speaking to Dentsu a few years ago, and a lot of it's still VIK. If you think Murtha Pools, the pool suppliers, one of their global partners, it kind of shows where they are there. But on the wider agency involvement, yeah, they turned to Sport5 to sell the rights, 23 to 28. They are selling the rights worldwide with the exception of Dentsu in Japan and APAC, although Sport5 still did the EBU deal, which is crucial for exposure for sponsors. So, yeah, really interesting. They actually had an RFP in 2022, which may have been a way in for private equity. It wasn't, but they did talk about bringing an agency involved then for a kind of broadcast sponsorship sales, host city, procurement, shaping the event calendar. And I think they were pretty close because, you know, we were certainly talking to them about it, but it never really came to fruition. So in the end, they kind of went with this kind of piecemeal approach of certain agencies. So they've changed a lot and they haven't, if you know what I mean. It's not been a revolution.
I think just before I bring John in to talk about private equity, swimming is one of those sports that does really flourish when there's a star in the mix, isn't there? In Canada, we've got Summer McIntosh, who's the golden girl of world swimming right now. She's got 3 world records, 3 Olympic golds, 7 World Athletics titles, and she's only just 18. She was born in 2006. Isn't that amazing? But there was an interesting note about her that I read this week that she's sponsored by the likes of Red Bull, Lululemon, and so forth. And she was actually allowed to wear Red Bull, her personal sponsor, on her Swimming Canada uniform. And Red Bull is paying a license fee to Swimming Canada to allow that to happen. So the draw of a star like her, I mean, she's in the Katie Ledecky realm of stardom. And she's very young, she's very personable, she's very appealing. So swimming really benefits from when those young stars emerge, doesn't it? And that helps broadcasters and sponsors around the world to really focus where they're going to invest. And perhaps, as John, you were going to talk about private equity as a possibility in swimming, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, we're not privy to any conversations that kind of governing body or executive board of World Aquatics have had. I mean, Martin's gone through the numbers and, you know, they're in a very strong commercial position as it is. And actually this week, you know, the Sport5, Martin was just mentioning their role, have just brokered a new deal with NBC in the US to 2028. So obviously a lot of that's going to probably go on to Peacock, but it keeps that strong window for swimming in a huge market like that. You know, private equity has been sniffing around a lot of international federations over the last couple of years, purely because, a lot of these governing bodies need the money. We've written chapter and verse of how well they do in an Olympic year, and then do people kind of forget about them in between? And it's very difficult to be kind of balancing your budgets. But the rowing has talked publicly about looking for private equity. Martin did a piece with World Athletics last year with Seb Coe, I think in a press conference, wasn't it, Martin, where he kind of admitted that they had talks with various investment funds and I think potentially PIF as well, as you'd expect. And interestingly, the Skiing Federation, FIS, in December turned down an offer from CVC worth about 400 million euros for a kind of commercial vehicle. And interestingly, the CVC letter in that, and this is a long way round coming back to swimming, but the CVC letter to FIS said they claim there was significant growth opportunity for snow sports via investment and innovation. And that is a crucial word. When you talk to private equity firms or private equity people that are getting involved in sport, they like innovation. They do not like static things as they were. They like to look at something that's shiny and has growth potential. If you look at swimming right now, you probably don't have that. You've got the World Championships in 25 metres or 50 metres or short course or long course. And then you've got your high diving World Cup, which is probably the most interesting thing to look at on television just because it looks spectacular. But it potentially, for private equity to want to get involved, they need to be looking at something new, which interestingly kind of leads back to the International Swimming League, or ISL, another ISL that went belly up in this industry for some of our older listeners. Now, the International Swimming League started just before COVID, run by a kind of Russian-Ukrainian banker, I think. You can see why the money ran out there. Just couldn't get the money out of those countries when the war hit. Now, that went into a massive legal battle with World Aquatics, which I think World Aquatics won. It was over restriction of trade, essentially. But it was the idea of having a league where, Catherine, you mentioned individuals. It's got to be about making the individual a big name, whether it's Katie Ledecky, whether it's Adam Peaty, who was involved in the original ISL, and making these people front and centre, not every week, but certainly not once every 4 years. And I think that's what maybe World Aquatics could look at doing, some kind of franchise league or something that a private equity firm would absolutely look at and go, we've got so many national federations around the world. These people are into it. You've got a good free-to-air television property. The revenues are good. Where can we take this sport? Right now, it's, the World Championships. Can you do anything different? But if they could get back into some kind of league that World Aquatics, I'm sure, would be interested in, but want to run themselves, not, a third party, which caused legal problems before. I think that is where you could then create something new for this sport that, as Martin has written this week, is in a very healthy financial position. Whether it can afford to take that step up on its own to go and launch something new is very doubtful, which is why private equity is interested.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree with. World Athletics and FIS, you mentioned, they have new IP, and new IP is what private equity gets interested in, among other things. Swimming, I think, still recovering from ISL. Was a disaster. Suppliers that we know of were not paid. I think the money was already drying up before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on the legal point, World Aquatics did win in the first instance, but it's kind of been bouncing about court since 2018. There is a US District Court trial at the start of 2026 when we might get some kind of definitive outcome. Yeah, I look at it and I do, not that I have private equity investment eyes, but I look at the revenues stemming from the World Championships, the World Short Course, and a bit of Swimming World Cup, but nothing new, nothing athlete-driven that YouTube would be really interested in, that would be a destination and attract the kind of audience that, swimming would like to. They are innovating, I suspect, around production, and Sony's involved. Incidentally, we have asked World Aquatics a couple of times to speak to us. Hopefully we will be doing so, but we can't give their expressed opinion on this because they haven't spoken to us yet, but we hope to speak to them soon. The figures are the figures. There's growth there. It's solid. It's not spectacular. You look at maybe CVC's investment in League One and Premiership Rugby, which are much riskier, but I don't know, where's the big return from swimming? What is the sell? What are you buying into? What is different, and instead of shaking up the market differently? And as Catherine says, how are you really benefiting from these stars that have these flashpoints in Olympics and to a lesser extent World Championships?
All right, gentlemen, thank you for that. We'll wrap it up there. And just to let our listeners know that we have just released a story on the World Aquatics financial results, including details of the commission payments made to agencies. So look for that on the Sport Business website. And right now, we'll move on to part 2 after a short break. We'll be right back.
For a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping global sport, sign up to the Weekly Digest, our free newsletter packed with essential insights. Subscribe at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to part 2 of the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sport business industry news. We're now going to take that promised deep dive into the Uefa Women's Euros, which of course wrapped up last weekend with England's stunning win over world champion Spain, earning them their second consecutive crown of European champions. And Martin and John are here with their hot takes, and we'll also have high-end insights from 2 women who've been following the tournament up close. My colleague Maria Kholodova. Hi Maria, good to have you back.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we have a special guest today, Flo Lloyd-Hughes, the founder of the women's football media platform, The Cutback. And she's also a frequent guest reporter on Sky Sports WSL coverage and host of her own women's football podcast, Counter Pressed. Flo, very good to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been in Switzerland for the past few weeks. Have you recovered yet? And tell us a bit about your time there.
I definitely haven't recovered, and that's thanks in part to 9 p.m. kickoffs that go to extra time and penalties. So you don't really finish post-match until about 1:30 a.m. And then if you're doing a podcast afterwards, that turns into 3 a.m. And then you get straight into pre-match for the next games straight away. So yeah, it felt like a 2 and a bit week music festival. I only went out to Switzerland just before the knockout stages. So I was there from Sweden, Germany, last of the group stage, England, Wales, and then into the final knockout stages. And yeah, anyone that's covered a major tournament knows that it's an endurance sport really to keep going through that. But I will say, as someone who was wrongly probably skeptical about Switzerland's football culture, especially when it comes to women's football, I would say that apart from the price tag of things, which is insane, the atmosphere and energy for the tournament was amazing. The way that all the host cities and the people kind of took women's football in there, absorbed it and were so excited about the tournament, and it was so present everywhere. I've been to a lot of major tournaments all around the world, and sometimes you step into a town and you wouldn't even know that games were happening. But in Switzerland, there was not just UEFA Women's Euro assets and visibility and everything everywhere and merchandise, but there was also just general football enthusiasm. And, the tournament mascot, Madley, who was named after the first professional women's footballer in Switzerland and inspired by the St. Bernard dog, which is the dog of Switzerland, that mascot was sold out everywhere, and it was basically a treasure hunt trying to get that from the local supermarket. I managed to get one, and I got texts from people saying, "Where'd you get that? I need to get one. I'll pay you anything for it." So I think that just shows that there was such big energy and enthusiasm for a tournament, when I think actually a lot of people were quite skeptical when Switzerland were named hosts, but they did a really good job.
Flo, I have a solution for your endurance problem. I think if you become a Scottish women's football correspondent, 3 games in a week and you're back home, sorted.
So true. So true. That's the way to do it.
So, Flo, I'm sure you can speak to the attendance numbers. I think gate receipts were very good, perhaps surprisingly good. And also, I'd like to throw it out to the group after you speak to that about the viewing figures for the tournament in various countries around Europe and further afield. But first, tell us about gate receipts for the tournament. They were good, weren't they?
Yeah, it was. There was records shattered left, right, and centre. At every single game, there was a new record announced, which becomes a bit of a boring bingo card in women's football. One of my friends at a game turned to me and said, "Why is everyone clapping themselves for paying to be here?" So I do think sometimes that gets a little bit nauseating in women's football when there's such a sort of pat on the back. But I think it was impressive, again, going back to what I said about a lot of people not quite knowing what to expect and whether other people in Europe and whether Switzerland would really get on board with this tournament. I think there was this, deliberate angle with the tournament being hosted in a country that doesn't necessarily have many big stadia. So obviously the final in Basel was the biggest ground that Switzerland has, which is 38,000. We obviously in the last Euros had Old Trafford for the opener and Wembley for the final. So we had much bigger stadia hosting the whole competition. So in that sense, it felt like a bit of a drop because we didn't have any of these showpiece famous grounds hosting any games, because obviously Switzerland isn't necessarily established amongst the European elite, whereas in lots of other countries you would have a big national stadium that'd be hosting it, whether that's in Germany, France, England, Spain, whatever, and that would probably be 60 to 80,000 seater. So we didn't have that here. What they did get is really good numbers across the group stages, and that matters a lot because I think in 2022 we saw some maybe odd choices in terms of location and stadia, with Lee Sports Village, which is basically in Wigan, kind of in the middle of nowhere, and then Rotherham, which if you're an EFL head, maybe it carries kind of weight and nostalgia, but it's a bit of a random ground. And choosing to put the games there, I think sometimes they were a tough sell for a lot of fans and neutrals, as well as travelling supporters, whereas the travel and getting around Switzerland was so easy to navigate that I think a lot of people just decided to go to lots of games, and that meant the overall standard and attendances was really high in quite good medium-sized grounds. You didn't have these sort of high and low differentials where you've got Wembley selling out but no one going to see one game. It was really good across the board in the sort of 10 to 20,000 seater stadiums, which I think counts for a lot and made sure that lots of records were broken because there was just more grounds.
And I think having the trains run on time, and I believe train travel was free for the tournament, wasn't it? That surely must have helped.
Yeah, so you had a free ticket on the day of a match day, and Swiss trains were always running on time, very efficient. And I mean, I don't think many people would have got that same experience in England, or did a few years ago, as we all know. John, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I'm putting you on the spot because as a media, you probably didn't have to pay to go to any of the games. But what roughly was the kind of price point for a game? And I'm interested in fan experience and the demographic of the fan base there, because on television it looked like a real kind of family festival atmosphere, and I know Lumi, our producer, was there as well. Yeah, what can you tell us about that?
So I had actually bought tickets about a year and a bit ago because it's always safe to do that just in case. And lo and behold, once England made the final, everyone and their dog was texting me for a ticket. So it does pay off to be organised. So I'd bought tickets for both semi-finals and the final. The prices for those games range from about £30 to £90, I think, for Cat 1. So not that expensive. And I think that's probably similar pricing to what the last tournament was as well. Group games, I think, were about 20, 25 for the most standard tickets. The fans that I saw out there was a real mix. So I saw a lot of English families and families from other countries who travelled because it was school holidays pretty much everywhere around Europe by that point. But then once England were in the knockouts, it was a lot more, and actually for some of the group stage, that sort of millennial audience with a bit more disposable income, grassroots women's football teams, all travelling in groups. And also a lot younger than that, of younger sort of like maybe late teens, early 20s, almost sort of interrailing crowd, but we're doing that for the Euros. And then as it got later as well, a lot more kind of groups of mates, men and women, who'd come out for the final especially. And for the first time, I really saw the FA as well make a conscious and expensive effort to bring fans together in one central location. So they spent, I would imagine, a good amount of money taking over bars before every England game. So they called it Lioness HQ. And for the final, I'd never seen anything like it. They took over this huge, almost like warehouse in Basel, had it open all day from 10 a.m. And then after the game, it was open till 3 a.m., basically with a nightclub. You got one free drink, courtesy of their Budweiser partnership. But I'd never seen anything like it. So after the game, it was essentially a bunch of 20 to 50-year-olds just having a piss up in a nightclub. And it was amazing. And maybe that's something I don't think you could genuinely do that in the men's game. And I think it was also a good antidote to the sort of only families come and watch England as well, because that place was packed right till close. You know, people were there till the lights were turned on. So yeah, there was definitely a good mix, I think, of demographics.
Well, let's have a look at the audiences across television in Europe and further afield. Do we know, I think you all have some figures on the countries that played well: Germany, France, Spain, the UK. How were the numbers in these countries for the national team games and for the other games? And who wants to jump in there? Martin, you have something on that, don't you? John?
Yeah, I'll take question 2.
I'll start just because of, looking at the winners and the BBC's audience. I mean, obviously, as Flo will know, her deadlines weren't great, but the going into extra time and penalties is great for a peak audience for the BBC and ITV, and obviously both showed the final in the UK. The BBC numbers was the best of 2025 to date, 12.2 million peak on the BBC for that final across all their platforms. I think 11.6 was the television peak, and then I think the ITV came in a bit lower, as it always does. I think their peak was 4.2 million across all devices. So England, I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, it was a bit of a slow burner in the UK, certainly in the group stages. You were averaging about 3 million, I think, for the group stage games. But, once, as we predicted, once it got into that kind of quarterfinal stage onwards, and England basically used every inch of the game that was given to them, the minutes that were available to them. Yeah, the BBC and ITV will be delighted with those numbers. And as we reported this week, have teamed up, unsurprisingly, to show the World Cup, Women's World Cup in 2027.
Yeah, I mean, we could trot out a whole bunch of numbers, which we won't do, but I mean, certainly broad brushstrokes, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, all the figures in these countries for the national teams were really strong. What's really important to me and why it matters, I mean, people will be wondering, why are we talking in depth about TV ratings? I mean, these will form the basis of discussions for the next EBU deal, so they're important. Where will the media rights landscape be in 2029 is very important. And I would split it into 2 distinct categories before coming back to the sort of viewing figures for other games. I think this event has shown again that a mega event produces a live appointment to view audience for free-to-air TV. In lots of different countries, that can be, you can have an argument about advertising, which is sluggish in lots of countries. Free-to-air deals can largely be covered by advertising or free-to-view. If by 2029 we have a CASI TV equivalent in Europe that can refinance this with advertising, then I think the figures have proved that, if you're the rights seller, you can be punchy about retaining the value of your rights. The wider media rights malaise around pay TV churn and the falling rights fees, the Euros isn't a cocoon from the industry trend, but this isn't a pay TV product. It's a free-to-air product with a live audience. For me, and I'd be interested to know sort of, Flo's point of view as well, and where the women's game is. The challenge for me is, what is the interest in in countries who are not competing? So I think there was some really positive signs. In the US, Fox Sports got 1.35 million for the audience, which is a record. Their average per match was up 97% on, I think ESPN was streaming it last time. Germany, the figure for the final was 7.1 million in Germany. Obviously, they didn't play in the final, which is a brilliant figure. But France, you've got 1.7 million on TF1. We're watching the first 90 minutes. And in Italy, they weren't even showing it on a main channel. It was on Rai Sport, and it got 392,000. Which for me is not where you want your property to be. So all of these different countries are in different places. And I remember talking to one of the agencies that lost to 2 Circles for the UEFA Women's Champions League rights sales contract. And they said, well, we looked at this, but it was only worth a few million because the audience for the Women's Champions League outside of the 2 competing countries is really pitiful. So where does the product grow from here? If you're talking about maybe getting a Netflix involved, they will want, strength in global markets. I just wonder where we feel the Euros, as good as, the BBC figures are for the UK, and that's replicated in other countries, where is it as a product globally?
Yeah, so a couple of things to pick up on. I think England's in a very good place. The rest of the Europe, not so much. I think when you look at the media interest just at the tournament, Germany, Sweden, huge press packs, huge media covering the tournament. And I think those are reflected in the TV viewing figures. And even when you look at what BBC got for the final compared to what they got in 2022, which I believe was 17 million that they got peak for that home Euro. So there is a bit of a shift there. But obviously the tournament was at home, so I think it is different. So I think England, Germany, Sweden, all in a good place because there's been now a long-running passion and interest in the women's game. And you see that with the amount of fans that travel to major tournaments. You see that with the strength of the individual club brands, and you see that with the strength and popularity of the national teams. I think when you look elsewhere, there's a huge juxtaposition with how, without getting too sort of philosophical, there's a big challenge of how women doing sport are viewed within those countries. So in Italy, for example, I think the semi-final was on free-to-air, but the semi-final just being on free-to-air was a story in itself. Women playing sport being on free-to-view television was almost a national story. So then when they're not involved, it's back behind the paywall. And I think you see the same challenge in France, as much as L'Equipe actually covers quite a lot of women's football nationally. Despite hosting a World Cup in 2019, despite having some quarterfinal, semi-final appearances now in major tournaments, the interest in women's football is just not there. Lyon have won a ton of Champions Leagues, yet only a few thousand go to their games. So I think sometimes you've got to look deeper at the way that women's football is kind of viewed on a societal level in those countries. And just by seeing the handful of Italian press that were in attendance at the Euros, I think you get a sense of that. And even Spain, I think, suffers from that. Barcelona have a huge following and huge interest. But in the pre-match press conference, the Spanish captain, Irene Paredes, was asked by a female Spanish journo, what do you say to the people in Spain who still refuse to watch women's football? Which I just thought was a bizarre thing to ask someone on the eve of a major tournament final. And she rightly said, well, I shouldn't have to tell those people why they should watch women's football. So I think sometimes you have to unpack the sort of overall societal things that go on in those countries. And I think the visibility of women's football in England and Germany and Sweden has progressively meant that there's been consistent outreach and growth. But I think the challenge now is in those numbers as well, outside of those teams competing. Like you said, Martin, I haven't seen that many numbers, and I haven't probably dug enough into what ITV and BBC got for those games in which England weren't playing. Like, where is that appetite just for women's football more broadly, that we see a challenge sometimes for the WSL, and England winning was hugely important for them, because if they hadn't have got to the final, I think that has a significant impact on how the season looks. But that is the challenge, is where's the appetite just outside the Lionesses, because the England brand is so strong. I mean, if you look at the Instagram followers that England have on their own, it's huge. You know, that's more than some men's football teams can carry. But outside of that, it's the safety and the success of the whole game is a little bit different.
Maria, you're a huge fan of women's football, and I believe you're, first of all, passing on your love for the game to your 3-year-old niece, who was supporting, you'll tell us which team she was supporting and what it meant to her. But you've written extensively about the media rights for this tournament, and perhaps you could tell us about how the media rights sales process has been different to previous editions.
Yes, my sister sent me a picture of my 3-year-old niece right after England won the final, kind of like right up against the screen, kind of almost celebrating with the team. It was really sweet. But in terms of the media rights, obviously the widest spanning deal was the European Broadcasting Union Agreement, the EBU deal, which was 34 territories and 37 broadcasters. And while it's typical for the EBU to strike these sorts of deals, this was the first time that the Women's Euro was actually sold as a standalone package in Europe, as opposed to being packaged in with the men's or the youth tournaments. And we understand that this actually helped more members commit to show the tournament, because previously maybe they wouldn't have been able to commit to, some of the really high financial expectations that would come with buying rights to the men's tournaments. And so this time around, the EBU deal also included the UK and Germany, which I think a lot of people might not have realized. And in the UK, the Euros were obviously shown by BBC and ITV, and in Germany it was ARD and ZDF. And we can't actually really do a like-for-like comparison with previous deals in terms of, comparing the values, because this was the first time it was a standalone. But we understand that overall, when you take these territories together and kind of look at the allocations that were assigned to them in the previous deals, this is considered to be an uplift. And a lot of that value comes from obviously Germany and the UK, as they're the biggest markets in that deal. But rights for women's football in these big competitions have been continuing to rise in value. And in the UK, these rights were added to the listed events regime in 2022, which means that they essentially have to be shown on free to air. But this means that while the outcome in terms of who was showing the rights probably wouldn't have been different whether or not they were part of the EBU deal, but it just represents a slight shift in the way these rights are sold and a kind of a belief in the EBU to be able to strike these kinds of deals and support the women's game in that way.
What about deals outside of Europe? How have those evolved over the course of the last two tournaments? Has there been an improvement?
Outside of Europe, I think the biggest one, and we spoke about this already a little bit, was the US deal, which was quite interesting because before the rights had been with ESPN for a while and Fox took those over, I believe, last year. And that, I think, as we spoke about the viewing figures, that did really well. And I think from what I've heard from friends in the US, that coverage was really good, you know, kind of a lot of good analysis and kind of bringing people into the game and kind of showing them what it's all about, as opposed to just assuming that they kind of know what's going on, right? Because A, football's not that big there. B, you know, it's the Euros. So it's not necessarily like they kind of watch knowing all the players and what the big deals are and whatever. So I think on that side, it was quite good. Financially, I'm not sure that obviously they would be matching what's going on in Europe in terms of values for those deals. But I think generally coverage was quite good.
I suppose the question now is, will there be a knock-on effect for women's leagues around Europe? Will they benefit from the strong audiences in various countries? Will we see WSL audiences go up? And what happened to them after the 2022 tournament? How did WSL audiences evolve after that? And what do we expect going forward?
There was a boost after 2022 and then things kind of plateaued, definitely the start of this season, and dropped a little bit, which I suppose is maybe a wider reflection on just the UK economy and how people are choosing to spend their money. But at the same time, I think there's been more people spending on music gigs than ever before in the UK. So I think some industries are doing better than others. But I think there will be a boost. I think the game is still at a point where the success of the national team drives pretty much everything, which isn't necessarily a good place to be, but that's just the reality. Lots of clubs will be hoping that they will move beyond that reliance on the profile of the national team and the profile of the players who play with their club too. So Arsenal, off the back of the 2022 Euros, really used the profile of the players who played for Arsenal who were part of that squad, and that really drove a massive lift in sales. Now, before really the tournament had even finished, Arsenal had announced that they'd sold 15,000 season tickets and kind of bundles for their Emirates home games. Now they're playing all their home games there. So that was even before England had won the tournament. So I think lots of clubs will be hoping to try and cash in on this. There were already leaflets and advertising from Chelsea and from the WSL on the day of England's parade. So WSL had a big spread, I think, in the Metro, on the front of the Metro, and then there were some Chelsea leaflets that I saw being kind of handed out as well. So lots of clubs working hard to cash in. Some clubs do it a lot better than others. Some clubs don't really action that much on marketing and sort of just expect fans to turn up. I think the reality for Premier League teams is that you've never really had to market in the 21st century anyway, because your brands have just become so popular. And as we know, the media rights have been so lucrative that you don't actually need to try that hard to get bums on seats. Whereas obviously for a lot of these Premier League teams, they're now looking after WSL sides and marketing WSL teams, where actually you have to be a lot more proactive and you actually have to spend money on billboards or marketing campaigns or social media ads or reaching out to communities, or even just actually have a functioning mailing list. You know, I think in the US, franchises are so much better at being proactive. I went to one Gotham game and I get texts and emails from them literally every week. Whereas if you go to a WSL game, it's very rare that someone even follows up and asks if you want to go again. So I think they've just kind of fallen behind in putting those actionable things in, and just expect that the rise of women's football will mean a rise in people going to watch their games, when actually it does require a fair bit of effort to do it. So I'd be interested to see, and I'm already seeing it even just in the last few days, clubs making and putting a lot more effort into the marketing, and it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the start of the new season, which is only in a couple of weeks, well, kind of beginning of September, so about a month away.
Has there been? I'm interested to know if there's been a big shift. I mean, I look at the discrepancy between the huge audience and impact of the Euros and England winning versus the kind of, stagnating value of the WSL media rights, the drop. I mean, this was slightly dependent, I think, on Bristol City. I've got a big audience, but a drop from 7,350 to 6,600 per match in WSL attendance over the last couple of seasons. I look at that audience and it appears to me just be such a loyal, returning, young, valuable audience. But has it become capped somewhat, or can it grow? I see it as a very young, football-playing, engaged audience and loyal audience that is returning. But I worry that the breakthrough, despite all of England's success, has not really been capitalised on commercially, be that ticketing, be that merch, be that TV audience, or be that TV rights values.
Yeah, I would agree with you to some extent. I think so much of it relies on the individual clubs and the work they do. So you couldn't probably have that argument for Arsenal, who released their own Arsenal Women collection, sold really well, sold out of some things. We know that Arsenal in general with Adidas do tons of collaborations and they always sell really well, and they put the women's team at the forefront of lots of those campaigns. So I think it's just a real club by club basis. You've also got some teams who I think maybe made the jump into main stadiums too early. So Aston Villa went into Villa Park. It looks really empty for most games. It's obviously a ground that's familiar to the overall fan base, but they aren't filling it very well. Whereas Leicester City went quite early into the King Power and they get pretty good numbers there consistently. So I think it really differs on the club. And, I know the league for a while have been trying to support and incentivize teams to really improve their marketing, but it's taking a really long time. And I think it'll be interesting, 65,000 people turning up to the Mall to watch England lift the trophy, I think is a prime example of there's massive appetite there. It's just who's cashing in on those fans who now have an appetite to go to games. Are you reaching them? I also think some clubs maybe are spending too much time trying to chase new audiences without realising that there's thousands upon thousands of football fans already at their fingertips who engage in the men's team, and perhaps you could also get them to support the women's team. I think some clubs are doing that a bit more, but Chelsea, for example, they've got a really successful women's team, but very few people that go to men's games at Stamford Bridge will go to women's games at Stamford Bridge. Kings Meadow, they sell out easily. It's really hard to get a ticket, and they fill 4,000 and a bit there easily every time. But it's a really different demographic. It's suburbs, southwest London, it's community. And then obviously Stamford Bridge is much more kind of hardcore, regular Chelsea men's fans. But those men's fans aren't transferring over, which seems strange because if I'm a football fan and I, love Chelsea or Arsenal, whatever, for me, I would say, well, let's try and just give them more football. They love football. Let's just give them more football to buy, to watch, whatever. But I think some clubs either aren't doing that or are struggling to make that conversion. And I wonder if we'll see, I think, I can't remember what club it is. It might be Aston Villa, but I did see a club this season was offering an incentive around fans that went to the men's games, or the women's games, they would get extra points. I think that's going to be interesting to see if that could be a driver. And once fans kind of get that appetite naturally on the men's and women's side, it's a win-win. Because I also think, I don't have kids, but I know John does. When you're a parent with young kids, you can't commit to something every weekend. Plans change. You've got sport that you're taking your kids to. So personally, I always feel it's, maybe not the best idea to rely on the family pound because you can't necessarily ensure commitment. Whereas there's actually a really bigger, a more exciting audience who just love football, who have money, who you can tap into. You've just got to make them want to come and make them feel like women's football isn't just for families. And I think Arsenal have done that really well, but it's actually hard to think of that many other examples in the league of clubs that are hitting those demographics.
A fantastic conversation, all. Thanks so much. Flo, thank you for joining us, our first guest on the podcast. Such great insights. It's good to see women's football taking center stage, as it has over the past few weeks, onwards and upwards for the women's game. Now we're going to take a short break before moving on to see what's in store for next week, with Martin and John revealing what they've been looking into. You won't want to miss that. We'll be right back.
Enjoying the conversation? Follow the Sport Business Podcast and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're finding it valuable, leave us a rating and a review to help others discover the show.
Let's move into the final part of today's Sport Business Podcast. John, Martin, we're going to take a look ahead to next week. I want to know what's on your radar, but just looking back to what we've just talked about, I've been instructed to ask John about, there was an iconic slide tackle, wasn't there, on you around 2017 that you didn't play again for the rest of that year. And I think it has something to do with our guest, Flo. I'm told that she absolutely halved you in a football match when you were both at SportCal. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it was on, I think it was Wimbledon Park or something like that. It was a late two-footed tackle that she'd clearly seen at Loftus Road, one of the QPR hackers. But there's a legal case still ongoing, so we can't talk too much about it for compensation reasons and embarrassment as well. So moving on. Moving
right along. So what do you see? What are you looking at for the week ahead? Martin, start with you.
I'm looking at LIV, which may surprise you, Catherine. I'm kind of mourning the obviously the four majors have happened now in golf. They're very close together now. The Ryder Cup is at the end of September. But yeah, I caught a bit of the JCB. Nearly actually wanted to go, but I couldn't make it down there. But it was very well attended, cool looking course. So I was going to check in with the Chicago event, which is August 8th to 10th at Bolingbrook. I mean, my issue with LIV, and I'm speaking as a fan, the tech is great. It looks good. It's different. And, you know, a lot of the visualizations have been built into sort of other golf broadcasts now. It's a big part of the reason I don't watch actually is because the way that the host broadcast works and that you're told constantly how good it is. It's different from other golf events in the sense of, you know, you can't have a sort of studio presence there. The international rights holders, yeah, they can put their own commentary in their own language, but, you know, they kind of take the interviews with what was Greg Norman being interviewed by an employee of LIV, telling him how great, you know, LIV is. And there's no kind of nuanced criticism of certain events and that maybe, you know, Sky would be better at with the PGA Tour, DP World Tour. Some people might say, well, I'm just, you know, being a bit of an old golf fuddy-duddy. But yeah, it is. I did actually quite enjoy just watching a bit of the highlights, though, on ITV. I will tune in. The reason it's partly on my radar is because I was looking actually at, you know, some of the figures that get forgotten about a bit around the business model. There's been a bunch of hosting deals announced in the last week. A new deal in South Africa for LIV back in Adelaide, which is a big success, the Adelaide event, and Singapore. Hosting in 2023 was actually LIV's, from an international point of view, the biggest revenue stream, which might surprise people. It was $13.6 million US from hosting fees, ahead of sponsorship, which was just under 10 million. Obviously, there was quite a lot of Saudi sponsors, Russian included in that figure in 2023. It's changed a bit since HSBC's come on board, so that these dynamics will be changing a bit. Ticketing and hospitality, 7.5 million US. It owns its own sort of ticketing hospitality operation, so that's a good revenue stream. Broadcast was only $3 million US. This is an international figure. It excludes LIV Inc. in the USA, and clearly it continues to make huge losses. You know, big 9-figure losses at an international level. Then you'll have the LIV Inc. figures. But anyway, speaking as a fan, the lull in the other golf calendar worldwide has led me to watch a bit of LIV. And aside from the comments I made about the host broadcast, I quite enjoyed it. Have you watched Happy Gilmore, Martin? No, you're a golf fan. That brought LIV and the PGA Tour together nicely. I have watched Happy Gilmore. It did. And for anybody who hasn't seen Happy Gilmore or 2, which came out obviously to great acclaim recently. I mean, it's very silly. It's slightly immature, but it's good fun. And there's a good spoof of LIV in it. It's worth a watch. John, what are you looking at for next week? Yeah, so we've got the 100 starts on the 5th of August here in the UK. And it's kind of the last year that it's going to look
like it is. It's only a few years old itself. But we reported this week on Sport Business that 6 of the 8 franchises, those sales have now been completed, and the last 2 have been given a little bit of an extra deadline to get those completed. We've written in depth and actually spoke on the podcast before about the private equity money going into that. But yeah, there's going to be big changes from next year. So this will be the last year where you'll see all the teams wearing the same New Balance kit, for example. Those central sponsorship contracts are going to be out the door from 2026, which will allow the new owners that have pumped all this money in to get a bit more of a return. So there was an article this week in City AM, Matt Hughes, that London Spirit are going to go to Nike next year, so they're the first team to kind of strike their own kit deal. At the moment, as I say, it's all very similar, bar the colours. And actually, there's going to be a name change next year, and I think this is really interesting to keep an eye out for. We've talked a lot about multi-club ownership in football, but I think it's really now a big thing in cricket. And the Manchester Originals are going to change their name from 2026 to the Manchester Supergiants, which will put them in line with the IPL's Lucknow Supergiants because they're owned by the same company. And they're also going to change their kit, we believe, from black to blue, potentially. So what will that mean for the kind of look and feel of the tournament? So I think this is the last year where you're going to see it as it is. It annoys plenty that it takes over the whole of August and kind of moves the test calendar around. But I think from next year, we're going to see this look a lot different to what it is now, which will fuel more revenue into the 100, I think.
So what about any other business? Is there anything you're looking at across the industry that strikes your fancy?
There's a couple of good stories about pre-season football tours and clubs looking to commercialise their fans more by charging for a pay-per-view viewing of a friendly against a team you don't care about with 30 players coming on and off the pitch. And 2 interesting ones. Fulham had a pre-season tour of Portugal, 2-match tour. They've done it before. Lots of fans thousands of fans have gone over there for a bit of sun, a few beers. The second game was July the 30th, so yesterday, against Al Ittihad. And Fulham announced, not that long, well, a week or so before the game, that it was actually going to be played behind closed doors. So you can imagine Fulham fans had already kind of booked their travel, weren't very happy. So what Fulham did instead, which was very good of them, they streamed the game on ffc.tv, and then they charged the fans $6.99 to watch it for a friendly. Just for one game. So extraordinary. And then another one on the kind of pay-per-view model, Barcelona's Tour of Asia, which if you've been reading Sport Business and other outlets has been farcical. A game that was was cancelled in Japan, then put back on because of a promoter issue. They've now got 2 games in Korea. They had done a pay-per-view for their members to watch a game. It didn't work during the first game in Japan. There were technical problems. People paid their money and didn't get anything. So they've now decided, unlike Fulham, that they are going to stream them for free on YouTube. So maybe they should all just stream these games for free anyway, bearing in mind how much they're taking money off these fans for tickets and merchandise, etc. So there's my rant.
Well, I had a little piece about what's going on in Mexico, and we're going to be writing about this in the next couple of weeks. But the Liga de Expansión, the second division of Mexican football, starts tomorrow. And of the 15 clubs, only one of them has a confirmed TV rights deal. The rest of them are still talking. Now, last half of the season, they were aired across 5 or 6 different platforms. But as of today, the 14 clubs, apart from Atlante, do not have a TV rights deal. And there's around 24 hours to go. So that's something that we'll be writing about next week and something to keep our eyes on.
Nothing with Televisa Univision. No light deal?
Nothing so far with Televisa Univision, no. But interestingly, the one team that does have a deal is with High Sports TV. So that's probably easier for you to say, isn't it?
Yeah. I follow them on X, I am aware. I just wanted to quickly add and bring it back to Happy Gilmore and Netflix. I thought looking at Netflix's half-yearly viewing figures, which came out recently, we did a piece in Sport Business about the drop for Full Swing, which is down 22%. Full Contact, Six Nations down 57%. It's now no longer continuing. The highly successful Drive to Survive was down 13% on the equivalent series in the equivalent period last year. I just think it's quite humbling when these figures come out, because you look at Drive to Survive, as successful as it is, it's in 127th place in terms of how the programs are viewed. Squid Game's got 840 million hours viewed. And you look at the kind of programs that Full Contact Six Nations, which was 2003rd in the rankings, behind Barbecue Showdown Season 3, particularly good season of Barbecue Showdown, and Bread Barbershop. Full Swing Season 3, 530th in the viewing figure rankings, was behind, and I know John watches this, Wags to Riches Season 1 and Shark Dog Season 1, maybe not really a crossover of audience for those two, and Grizzly and Live Lemmings, no, me neither, no idea. Drive to Survive did a much better. It was behind Paw Patrol, but I suppose lots of people watch Paw Patrol, lots of people get kids. And Happy Gilmore 2 broke records on the flip side, 46.7 million views in 3 days. It was the biggest US opening weekend for a film on Netflix, but that was the global figure, and it has broken records all over the place. So yeah, docuseries not the thing, silly films is the thing apparently.
And there you have it. Well, I think that was, as usual, informative, insightful, and a lot of fun. Thank you all, and thanks also to Maria and Flo for joining us earlier in the podcast. And if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate rights fees across media and sponsorship, you can take a look at subscription options on our website or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. And if you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. You can share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms, and watch for our weekly LinkedIn posts promoting the podcast, where you can, of course, leave a comment. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.